Ladies and gentlemen, I am very lucky to be joined on the podcast this week by Milena Williamson, whose new collection, Into the Night That Flies So Fast, has just been brought out from Daedalus Press. Hi Milena, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is a really in-depth poetry collection based on a tragic and slightly bizarre case in rural Ireland in history. It's around the tragedy of Bridget Cleary. And I was wondering if you could first of all tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what made you write about this particular event.
Yeah, I moved to Belfast in 2017, so I've been here 6, almost 7 years. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I'm currently a teaching assistant at Queen's University Belfast, where I finished my PhD in poetry there, which was incidentally the PhD in poetry not about Bridget Cleary. This was my side project that I guess I started in 2018, just before my PhD. And I think it's a kind of case of the side project sticking with you for longer than you expect, and I just kept going because I had this idea. I found out about Bridget's story. When you start small, I thought I'll see if I can write 20 poems, for example, an arbitrary number, and it just grew from there. So there's a lot to talk about: the context, who Bridget is, the research. Bridget Cleary was a woman who lived in rural Ireland in County Tip, and she was young and educated and opinionated. She was a seamstress. She was also married, childless. Those are just some of the kind of descriptors I would give Bridget. But she unfortunately, she got sick and she was killed by and while her family and members of her community were in the house where she lived with her husband and her father. So that's the context of the book.
So I think it's interesting that you said you started with 20 poems as the goal, because there are a lot more in this collection. This is packed with perspectives on the events around Bridget Cleary. But I think what fascinates me the most about it is it's part poetry, part play or drama, because you've created, I guess they're monologues or character perspectives.
Yeah.
I don't know what you'd call them.
I was talking to someone else recently, and they also used the word monologues, and she has a theater background. I don't think I thought of them as monologues. I guess with my poetry background, I thought of them as poems in voice, persona poems. But I'm also happy and willing to call them monologues now, as to each their own, because there's such a theatrical element to the book, which you mentioned. And I mean, that theatrical element is in the Bridget Cleary story right from the beginning, and that's where I start my book with my epigraphs.
You mentioned the members of her family, and you mention her husband being in the house with her, and you create poems around all those relatives and figures. And one of the things that really struck me when I was reading through this collection is you breathe this huge amount of humanity into them, and each character seems so individual. Some of them are weighed down by grief, and some of them are weighed down by guilt, and other ones they have that real Irish neighbourly thing of bless her. There's a really remarkable study of the different types of people you meet in rural Ireland, and I was wondering how much of your poems were inspired by real life interactions with Irish people that you've met, or how these poems formed for you. Do they come naturally?
That's a very good question. I think that's probably a sign that I was really immersed in the research. I wasn't thinking of real people I knew. I think this is part of what poetry is, and you had a great conversation recently with Camille Ralphs. She talked about trying on voices and also feeling a great responsibility, a great ethical responsibility to write in voice and to write about real people who lived in past tense, and how that's what poetry is, and really agree with what Camille said. So I think each poem, it's not like I had a set of questions where I asked myself, maybe I did subconsciously ask myself, how would this person have reacted? What did this person want? How did this person relate to Bridget? What was their stake in the situation? Because every person was different. Her cousin was someone who maybe looked at Bridget with a bit of jealousy, her female cousin, because Bridget was educated and had a level of independence, earned her own money through working and through taking care of her hens. So I think there was a complicated relationship between Bridget and her cousin. I think there was an incredibly tender motherly relationship, perhaps, between Bridget's aunt, who is a kind of stand-in figure for Bridget's mother, who died before Bridget, before the story starts. So there's no one way to talk about all these voices because they're all so different. In some ways, I think what unites the poems is that they are all the individual voices, but they are usually reflecting on Bridget or talking about Bridget in some particular way, whether it's while she's sick, after she's died. So I think it's each character, each person who lived, just trying to imagine how they processed, how they dealt with this trauma, that they were part of, complicit in, witness to, forced to see in this kind of situation where there were different people with different levels of power. There were different roles, different agencies. So I just tried to do each person justice in a different way, which makes it hard to talk about them as a whole.
It's the incredibly varied amount of perspectives, but you do give each one their own unique kind of presence within the collection, and I think it's a real achievement to gather that many voices, and if not, bring them together. As you said, they all fit. Like, they're all tonally in the collection solidly. They belong there. You talked a little bit about Bridget's mother and her aunt, and I do think, as I was reading the poem, and you're welcome to correct me, but I felt that there was very often, from the women characters in particular in your collection, there was an enormous sense of pressure lingering in the background of their thoughts. Some of them were concerned with what the neighbours would think. Some of them were concerned with what people would make of their neighbour. You have a few poems in there from neighbours of Bridget who liked her because she was nice and friendly and she was just a lovely woman in her own right. You write about that generational pressure and that societal pressure on women very well, always present in a lot of those poems. I was wondering if you felt conscious of that when you were writing the collection, or if it was something that came through when you were researching. I'd just be very curious to hear how that came about.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying a lot of the larger forces that kind of contribute to this difficult story, this upsetting story of how Bridget was killed. There are forces of patriarchy, there are forces of ableism, misogyny. And so I think I was very aware that when I was writing, especially those other women, but again, all of the characters, that those same forces that were acting upon Bridget and did contribute to her death, because they shaped people's beliefs, those forces, that those forces are also acting on the characters that survived, the people that survived. Fran Locke writes something, she's talking about the witch character, and she talks about how in the witch, which has come to the foreground of literature today, really, it's easy to hold her above, make her suffering special, make her unique, and that it's important to always remember the context, to think about those other forces. So I think that speaks to, what you're saying, that the voices are different, but there's a sense of unity between the poems, because I was just trying to capture so many things, a sense of maybe a particular kind of loneliness in a rural area, a particular kind of maybe suffering that was happening in the women who are separated by household, a kind of, maybe a lack of community or a desire for closeness that was, being watched and managed and negotiated, I think, especially by the men. Before Bridget got sick and was bedbound for 10 days before she was murdered, she was out for a walk, possibly delivering eggs. So it's like, what was she doing other than out in nature, possibly delivering eggs and earning some money of her own? It was as simple as that, something that all women, all people take for granted today in a lot of places, like being able to go out for a walk and being able to do your job and earn some money. And so, that was the kind of her last moments before things took a turn for her.
Absolutely. One of the things there that you mentioned was that you had all those different forces at play affecting both Bridget herself, ultimately in a very awful way, and then affecting the women who feel the aftershock of Bridget's death. You spoke about misogyny and a little bit of patriarchy, all of that weighing down on top of it. There's a very, and again, you're so welcome to correct me because this is your collection. There's a real feeling of man-made law versus, I guess, not natural law is probably the wrong term, but the law of the supernatural almost, because you do have a lot of supernatural echoes. There are ghosts, there are clever men who sneak through keyholes and stuff like that. There's a lot of that kind of thing going, and I remember reading the first poem, and that's really what hooked me in. Lawful is this amazing moment where Bridget's mother witnesses her going into the grave from next door, and I'm curious as to that distinction between what men decide is the law and how that comes up against superstition and the law of communities or the law of the wild, if you want, in that way. Is that something that you see crop up a lot in your work? Is it something that you're conscious of quite a bit?
It's interesting to hear you struggle for that term. I think moving slightly away from the law of the wild, but what I'm hearing you chat about is the law versus belief, and that's how I would put it, because there is, and I don't have a law background, but there's an unmistakable part of this. My book exists because a woman lost her life and because her family and community members were taken to trial. So much of the research is coming through law. It's coming through court records, which were testimony published in newspapers at the time. So there is a way in which all of these poems are entrenched in law and people's responses to law. And then there's a fundamental part of the book that's about belief, because what caused, in part, Bridget's death was this idea that she was sick, she wasn't acting like herself, she was away with the fairies, she was possibly a changeling, someone other than herself. And as Angela Burke writes in her really excellent book that does the kind of historical research about this case, Bridget was really unique because she was the only adult associated with this kind of changeling myth. It's more often associated with children, sick children. So on this topic of belief, and it does get back to what you said about there being something unified about the poems, all the poems in voice have a connection to a Shakespeare reference, image, line, play. So perhaps they're unified in that way. And for me, the play behind my book, which you would think it might be Macbeth, because Macbeth is the play that the judge at the trial references. It's one of the epigraphs of my book, which I can read. But for me, the play behind this book is actually Shakespeare's A Winter's Tale. And that's a play in which the king thinks his wife has had an affair. And even when he calls upon the oracle, and the oracle is delivered and says, your wife is innocent, he denies the oracle and says, I still think she's had an affair. And that is what sets up in this play her death, the death of his son, the banishment of his daughter. That play is fundamentally about how you can't actually change someone's belief and the disastrous consequences it can have. And so, yeah, that for me is a kind of key play of writing this work, my own work. And it's a play that I'm drawing on in the first poem, Lawful, because it's the mother, Hermione, kind of talking to her daughter, Perdita, at the end of this poem. So those are the lines I'm drawing from when I say, I pour my graces upon my daughter, my spell is lawful, tell me mine own. That's that Shakespeare reference in that particular poem. So every one of those voice poems has a moment where it becomes Shakespearean, given the Shakespearean nature inherent to the Bridget Cleary story already.
I am so ashamed to say that I didn't pick up on nearly enough of the Shakespeare that you had in those poems, and that is entirely on me, but that is amazing. Would you mind reading Lawful for us, if that was possible?
Of course, yeah. Lawful. Awake, Bridget Boland, Bridget's mother, who is dead. 3 young boys and 2 policemen disturb the earth beside me, burying the burnt knot of her body under the cover of night. She smells of soot, sun-dried sheets, chicken soup, and stirabout. The boy with the lamp reads a prayer, and in the tremulous glow of guesswork, he makes the story a little kinder. I pour my graces upon my daughter. My spell is lawful. Tell me mine own.
Thank you so much. A Winter's Tale is an interesting parallel because, again, it's about the fallout of, as you said, misplaced belief, or more importantly, willfully giving yourself into a belief that you have evidence isn't true. I was so interested in the way that you split the collection up in different places. So you have your voice poems, and then you have asides, which feel a little bit more biographical as you go. This is about, and again, please feel free to correct me, but it feels like this was a trip that you took intentionally to learn more about Bridget. It's your own personal experience in doing a bit of the research that possibly led to this collection. You have such a caution is the wrong word, but you have such a carefulness or delicacy when you are treading in Bridget's world in those asides. And I was wondering how that felt at the time and how you translated that into poetry.
I love hearing them called asides, because I think there's a lot of questions in this book where I don't even know what to call it. Are they voice poems? Are they monologues? Are they prose fragments? Are they asides? I don't know. So I love hearing these new words. Yeah, so I took the trip in 2021, I think, or 2022. It's around the time with the pandemic where things get a little bit blurry. So it came quite late in the process, I would say. It was a good few years in. Part of that was because of the pandemic and not being able to take it a bit sooner. So I think the trip was very much I don't know if confrontation is the right word, but it was a meeting of all the things that were already in my head, all the research, all the writing, all the drafts of poems, all the attempts to write something that I was happy with and felt acknowledged this difficult story in a way that I was willing to stand behind. So taking the trip was giving up a little bit of control, because there's so much when you're a writer. You write poems and they're completely in your control, and you tinker with them and you show them to people or not. And you have 100% control over your material in a lot of ways until it's perhaps published. But to take that trip, it was like I just felt like I really needed to see the landscape, talk to people, as scary as it was, because I'm quite shy, and just see what I was missing, and engage, I think, with a bit of a feeling of, why am I here and what is this about? And it's impossible to do justice in the aftermath of this story. But I'm not the only person also who has responded to Bridget's story through art. Several plays, Tom McIntyre, Margaret Perry, performance art, Yvonne McGuinness, Helena Tobin. I could go on and on. There have been lots of different works. There was a piece performed by the Ulster Orchestra in January, like a month, 2 months before my book came out, that was inspired by Bridget Cleary, that I didn't even get to respond to until my book was already on the publishing run. So there have been a number of adaptations. And I think with that proliferation, you want to go back to the source. You want to see if you can find the grave, which is unmarked and difficult to find if you haven't watched the one documentary about Bridget Cleary and stopped it at the right frame and kind of tried to see where is the person in the graveyard standing. And then you have to get to County Tipperary and wander through the graveyard and try and match it to something you've seen on a screen. It was an exercise of taking the things I've read about and making them real before I could finish my own adaptation, my own creative response to the story.
That sounds remarkably challenging as a thing to extrapolate out of experience. There was one poem in particular, I guess, that stood out to me, and I'm trying to find it here as I go through. It's where her husband leaves on the ship, and I have it noted here. I really need to start using bookmarks properly. Thank you so much.
It's 77. It's quite late.
So it's Into the Sea. Of course it is. Of course it's Into the Sea. And I found that really interesting because you mention in your notes at the end that it wasn't there, that information wasn't available, and so you have some idea of what happened to him, but you come up with your own version of how he feels about what happened. Michael clearly was surprisingly, he's pathetic in some ways. I think he comes across as quite an impotent man or a weak man. I was so interested with how you treat some of those characters with a delicacy, I think, that is surprising, because all you want to do, certainly when I was reading, was just, you wanted justice for Bridget to some degree, and you have a very realistic depiction, I think, of what justice might have looked like for a woman at that time, which is not much, unfortunately.
Yeah. Into the Sea is an interesting poem because it also came quite late, like within the last year or maybe even 6 months of kind of writing, revising. And that was when I was thinking a lot about basically how to get out of a poetry collection, like where does it end? Where does this story end? And I was thinking about the idea of loose ends and whether there were certain characters I needed to revisit. And I wrestled with that idea too, because I felt that writing more than one voice poem of any other character, because Bridget has the most voice poems, I was worried about what it would mean to do 2 of anyone else. But I did attempt to then give a few people a kind of Where Are They Now poem. I found Michael Cleary's name on the Canadian ship records, and that was something Angela Burke, in her research, she notes that he does say that he's going to Canada, but to actually then I spent so much time in the Irish archives, and then I went into the Canadian ship records online, and I had to dig through them, and to actually see his name and where are you coming from, where are you going, what's your occupation, all noted down on this one little line of a ship passenger log. It was really startling. I think it was really scary to know that he made it, he survived prison, and he made it there, and what happens to him beyond, I don't know. I know I'm reluctant to give, I don't have much sympathy for Michael Cleary, to be honest, although I think in part by writing this poem, I do give him another moment to speak, as it were, so maybe that does say something. I think it was more just in writing this poem, it was the acknowledgement that he suffers in prison. Maybe he is haunted by her. He falls from the roof and breaks his arm. Is that a different poem?
It's the second one. I think Into the Sea is the third Michael Cleary poem, is it?
That's a good point. I'm like, oh my god, how many? Oh yeah, he does have 3. I should know that.
He has 3, yeah.
He has 3, yes.
It's okay.
He's haunted. Yes, he's haunted by her in a different poem. Yeah, when he falls in another poem in Haunting, he falls from the roof in prison and he breaks his arm. And so basically I don't have much sympathy for him, but I felt that it might be important to acknowledge that he survives and takes this journey, and he gets a kind of where he goes to next poem, because there's such a sadness in that he does get somewhere next and Bridget doesn't. And so I didn't necessarily want to leave him in prison and have it be, oh, now he's in prison now and that's right and good. And I didn't know where to leave him, but I thought he goes to Canada and I've seen his name on this record. And so what must it be like to be away from the landscape that all you've ever seen, and to be out on sea and just be surrounded by nothing but blue and water? How bizarre. You've left that behind. You left that trauma, that horror, that crime behind. That was a long-winded answer, but
that's okay. I'm all for them. They're really a huge part of podcasting, so I'm all for them. I will say there's a man unraveling in those 3 poems, and I do think you get a real sense of his being at a loss. I don't want to say his loss, because you make a very good point. He is actually a character that is very undeserving of sympathy. He doesn't earn that at all. But he's definitely a man who is lost by the end of your 3 poems, and I thought it was a fascinating way to shine a light on him in the collection. You give a voice to so many people that feel Bridget's lost, but there are 2 poems in particular that absolutely knocked me for six. And I mentioned it to you when I got in touch with you about doing the interview. You give a voice to Bridget's dog, Badger, and you give a voice to her cat, whose name escapes me.
Dodie the cat.
I was immediately struck in the Badger poem in particular, because I have a massive soft spot for any classical painting that portrays a dog waiting by their either dead or dying master. They break my heart. I was wondering how you found out about Badger, or if Badger is a creation of yours. And then I was really hoping that you would read that phenomenal poem, which is definitely one of my favorite dog poems now.
Sure. Badger is very real. In answer to your questions, all these people are real. The cat is real. The dog is real. Yeah, they were all there in some way. I think I was thinking about, isn't there a dog in the Odyssey who waits for Odysseus?
Argus.
Yes, Argus, because we read that in school, and I had a teacher who cried when we got to that bit of the book, and it made a real impression on me. So, yeah, I was thinking about the kind of classical dogs of the world of literature, and also that, like Penelope, actually, Bridget was a seamstress. She sewed garments, and how there was some strange echoes of that too. Yeah, I'll read this poem. There is some wonder in this handkerchief. Enter Badger, Bridget's dog, who barks at journalists. I follow the scent from her feathered hat, hanging on a nail to a blue handkerchief crumpled on the floor. There's magic in the web of it, this last remembrance from her husband that my lady reserves evermore about her. I follow the scent to one gold earring glinting in the ashes, and to her husband who is scraping off the juice of some poor creature. I follow the scent to her body. She lies in the outhouse, and it masks her smell. The peelers guard her, and I guard the outhouse like the gates of hell. I lie in the dung, and there is not a woman who comes up the road who could be her. So you have all these items, the handkerchief, the gold earring, they were all kind of clues, unfortunately, things found to suggest what had happened to Bridget. So I wrote the dog as being this sort of another form of the detective trying to find the person that he loved. And there's a reference to the handkerchief that triggers a lot of heartache in Othello. Where is the handkerchief that Othello gives Desdemona? Who has it? Has she had an affair? So that the Shakespeare connections are already so integrated into the story. But yeah, every one of those voice poems has that kind of link to some kind of Shakespearean moment.
This is really important, and I want to make this clear to anyone who's listening to this interview. This is a book of phenomenal poetry. There's a ton of amazing poems that are filled with a raw human reaction to a horrible thing. And I do not want to detract from any of those poems by saying that this one is easily in the top 3 of the entire collection for me. There's something so much more heartbreaking in a dog that is loyal to the nth degree. Like, guarding the outhouse like the gates of hell is an image that I couldn't shake. And then the final line where there's not a woman who could come up the road that could be her, because it was just a devastating poem for me.
In some ways, those last lines speak to the otherworldliness of the animal-human relationships that I think people have with their pets today. And I've mentioned belief already, like the dog's unshakable belief as to who Bridget is. And the idea that she could be anything else, or be any kind of human changeling person who could be murdered. To the dog, she was just the person that he adored, and the person who probably looked after him and was kind to him, even if times were tough or that kind of thing. So there's an unshakable belief that the dog has in that Bridget is Bridget, and he knows who Bridget is, and he's waiting for her to come back, and he doesn't see her. And a lot of the humans in the story question who Bridget is, and that leads to violence. That leads to their violence, because they poke at her, and they don't know who she could be, and they want to know, and she doesn't seem right, and she's not herself, and that leads to the violence that the humans do.
I can't believe that I missed all the Shakespearean stuff now. But it's definitely not the only influence that's going on in this particular collection. I remember when I went into Act 3 of this, and when I was reading it, it was very clear that Act 1 is Bridget's world. You have the interval in the middle, which are some of your own personal poems, and some of those come from your first pamphlet, I think. Yeah. Then the third act is a fusing of the modern and the old. You have a lot more of Bridget's story, your story, and the modern world in general just brushing up against each other. But one of the things that I found really interesting, because I got quite lost in the third act sometimes, being like, what's this referencing? I can't get this. And then I read the notes at the back, and it was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I couldn't... First of all, myself and my partner are huge Buffy fans, so that was just... I was kicking myself from up and down, just going, I can't believe I didn't get that. And then I reread them with that context in mind. And so you've based some of those poems, or at least been inspired to write some of those poems, by episodes of Buffy. I was wondering if you could just walk me through what brought that about.
A few things, I think. On a kind of practical level, I think I was worried that the collection was going to be just too upsetting from start to finish. And so I wondered what another source would do for the collection, which is not to say that the Buffy poems are light and happy and fun. I think
they are not.
They have a darkness combined with a sense of humor, with the campiness of Buffy. So I have read them aloud at events, and they do make people laugh a little bit from time to time. So there is a lightness to them, and maybe people laugh too because there's a tone to them of that violence to them feels a lot closer to the era that we live in too. I think I can't quite capture how I got to Buffy other than to say Buffy starts like in the 90s. Buffy is 100 years after Bridget. What happens in those 100 years to get from Bridget Cleary to Buffy Summers? Of course, they're two different contexts. They're two different stories, fiction and fact, but they both have young women in them who are marked as different by the forces of the world. They do have, their names are similar enough. I think the first one I wrote was the arsonist poem, because Buffy's cover story when she moves to her new school is that she burnt down her gymnasium? Or that's the rumor that she had to leave her old school because she burnt down the gymnasium, presumably fighting a vampire of some sort, and then she gets expelled from school. And so there seemed to be this weird moment to me of the fire that killed Bridget being a kind of a symbol of which Buffy emerges from burning down a school. And it's like, and that violence of trying to use the fire in a different way. And then suddenly there's this girl in a new school who's been marked as having this storied past, and people don't know quite what to make of her. And that first episode, all she wants to do is make friends. But then we quickly learn about all the violent, magical things that she has to deal with on top of the day-to-day of trying to cover up a pimple and wanting a prom date. And I think that's what makes Buffy a great show, is that there's so much violence right alongside the ordinary, and the ordinary as it relates to a young woman. And I just felt that was given all those things in the show, I felt like it would enable me to speak through the show to Bridget, to speak through the show in a way to say, I'm a woman and I'm angry, and this is the weird and magical stuff I'm dealing with, and to respond to some of those things, some of those difficult forces that Bridget was dealing with, but to come at it through a whole other language, a whole other tone, a whole other kind of mood of images, all of which pertain to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So it's definitely an unconventional choice. It's an unusual choice, and one that's hard to explain.
I think it makes perfect sense. I took it to be, because, as you pointed out, there's so many parallels between Bridget and Buffy, but I think one of the things that really struck me when reading it was that they're both women that are set upon by the world and by forces completely beyond their own control. The supernatural haunts both of them in a sense, but one of them has the ability to deal with that, or not. If you're a big fan of Buffy and you remember the end of season 1, I don't want to spoil it for anyone that hasn't seen Buffy. They both succumb to the weight of the forces against them, but one of them has the it's just birthright for Buffy. She has the ability to come back from that. But I thought there was something very cathartic in a woman getting a chance after something like that. And I really enjoyed that sequence, and I was really taken aback. Then, as soon as I had read that, like, there's phrases like, oh, Peachy and stuff, and I was like, oh, it's Buffy. Of course it's Buffy. Just to bring us to an end, you end each of your acts with an unusual poem around an understudy, the chorus, and the actress. Though they're a definite joy to read, but they are very layered in a way that I found really interesting to engage with. So I was wondering why they exist and what you think they represent.
I definitely saw them as these transitional pieces, and they're pieces in which the stage directions that kind of set up all the voice poems, those stage directions become the whole poem in those three that you mentioned. So I guess in those poems, for me, it's almost the world of the theater kind of taking over. And because there's theater referenced in Bridget's story when the judge quotes Macbeth and then says, "We are not here acting a play, but to inquire into matters of fact." So there's theater in the story, but then there's also been theater made in response to Bridget, so plays by Tom McIntyre and Margaret Perry. And I guess there's this proliferation of Bridgets that exist, and every time those plays are performed, another woman is taking on that role of Bridget. And there's a poem, The Understory, where I was thinking about all these, not only the women playing the role of Bridget, but also the women in the world of the theater who are waiting to play this role, who are the second line. And also I was thinking about how this book is a book where, like, Bridget is the main character, for me at least. And so I'm the understudy, and I'm the understudy to Bridget. So yeah, for me, those poems are interesting because I struggled a lot with them, and to know whose voice I was really writing them in. I think I'm just writing them in the voice of someone who, like myself, who loves the theater and has been immersed in any kind of show. And then, as often happens before the interval, you're pulled from one story into another, and the lights come on, and everybody in the crowd starts talking. You're surrounded by noise, and those poems, yeah, just are pivot points, and they hold the collection together in a way that reminds us about performance and about roles and identity and how these things are slippery and contextual. I'll read the chorus. The chorus. I am wiping lipstick from my teeth when the door opens. 3 women enter from another era, talking wildly. How could someone believe her lace thong was evidence? In the theater of the bathroom, I roll a cigarette. Tell me about it, I say. The sergeant found my nightdress when he climbed through the window. He picked the lock and wrote it all down. Such pictures, the adornment of my bed, and the contents of the story, what I had been reading late. He stole my nightdress and used it as proof in court. Proof of what exactly? Echo the chorus of women, and I cannot remember, as if I were asleep when it happened. The women touch my arm, maybe a motherly touch. In that poem, I am a little bit still writing as Bridget, because the sergeant did find her nightdress when he went into the house, but I'm thinking of the other women whose clothes were used as evidence, the lace underwear that was used in more recent cases to prove terrible things about, or to try to prove terrible things about what happened and who did what in Ireland and the suffering caused. So I think it's a poem, and it takes place in the bathroom. It's this, in the theater of the bathroom. It's how this world of the theater and the theater of this book breaks down into new spaces, and the story of Bridget and the nightdress becomes the story of an underwear in another time and place. So it is this kind of slipping between worlds, and those, I think of them as stage direction poems. That's what I call them, because they're bracketed off like stage directions sometimes are.
There's such a wonderful haunting quality to the whole collection, in that it lingers with you after you read it, and it sticks. And Milena Williamson, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and taking the time to talk to me about this collection. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. No, thanks for having me, and it's great just to chat.
The collection is Into the Night That Flies So Fast. It's by Milena Williamson, who you've just been listening to, and it is from Daedalus Press, and you can find it just about everywhere that poetry is being sold. If you enjoyed this interview, please consider giving me a review wherever you listen. Every review helps to get the podcast out to more people. If you'd like to follow Milena Williamson on social media, I've included her links down below. If you'd like to find her book, I've included a link to the website where you can purchase it. I cannot recommend it enough. If you'd like to keep in touch with the podcast, there are a few ways you can do so. You can find it online at www.wordsthatburnpodcast.com. You can follow it on Instagram at Words That Burn Podcast. You can follow it on TikTok at Words That Burn. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this week's episode, and hopefully you'll hear from me again soon.